tell you a little bit about the key center of design computing and perhaps the first 40 years or so. That's fascinating because that's actually not my talk. That's another talk. That's my talk. I joined the faculty in 1966. I was actually quite young then, relatively young now. And the university had 2 computers, but nobody knew about them. They were at the bottom of the physics building, and they had these high priests running them, and you needed signed permission to drop these punch cards into this hole in the wall, where 3 or 4 hours later would come this scroll that said error 1685. And you went to this book that told you what error 1685 was, and then you'd come back to the faculty and try and work out what all that meant. And no one in the faculty had actually ever heard of a computer, which was not unreasonable. It was a traditional faculty of architecture producing high-quality professional architects. And for some reason, I thought it would be interesting to bring computers into what was then architecture. And so, in those days, you could do something you can't do today. You could just decide what was in a course. The course was course 1, course 2, course 3. No, architecture 1. And you could do studio, and you could do this, and you could do that. And anyone could make up what was in the course. There was nobody else consulted. Which turned out to be good. Because we started to teach programming. There was no computer science department. That came along 10 years later. Just to give you some idea, Stanford, the year before, had started a computer science department. The first, right? So this wasn't traditional stuff at all. And I would say the architecture students fell into 3 groups. The majority complained like mad. And, I was young and I said, well, you don't know enough, so I'm going to not take too much notice of you. There was a much smaller group who thought, well, if we have to do this, okay. And then there was a tiny group who said, fantastic, can we get more? I had a meeting with people who graduated in the period 1970 to 1975. We're having a reunion. And you'd be surprised how many people in that group ended up being involved with architecture and computers. Amazing numbers. So, what was it like? It was painful by today's standards. Truly painful, but the students were amazing. The students did incredible things that intellectually today are still incredible. Just the mechanics was so hard. We did floor plan layouts using an algorithm that had just been published. And these are architecture students. Their education up to that point was, if there are a lot of architects people here, I'm sorry, had been what kind of pencil to use. But we had very sophisticated ideas. Things like the planning code of Sydney turned out to be geometric. And you could model that. And I'll tell you more about that later. And kids came up with these incredible things like different strategies for playing Monopoly. So you got this computer program that played Monopoly against itself. And it could do 10,000 games. And haiku poetry. We had all this stuff up on the walls, all of this haiku poetry that looked as good as any other haiku poetry. As somebody who didn't fully understand it. And then I went to the US in 1968 and discovered you could buy a plotter. What a weird idea that you could have graphics. Harvard, in the meantime, had started up a graphics lab doing line printer graphics. So I bought this plotter physically in my arm back to Australia, and these students did amazing things. All the Islamic tile patterns can be constructed with a single bent line. take a line, divide it by into the golden mean in 1, rotate it by the golden mean radian, and just do different transformations, you get all the tile patterns. These are undergraduate architecture students. Beautiful stuff. And then we got into interactive graphics and, of course, interactive games, which is a synonym for war games. These were males. We took over the central computer from midnight to 5 a.m. and built these war games, battleships and bombers. But we insisted, or I insisted, that the physics be correct. So we did all the physics, the momentum of bombs dropping, and anyway, it was very sophisticated for its day. I'm really sorry we didn't patent it. We could have become rich. So these were all undergraduate architecture students. And then we thought practitioners ought to get into this. And we were very lucky that the New South Wales government architect had taken a course just for the fun of it and got very interested. So we started to have these courses for practicing architects. And it was about, we started in 1968, this is 1969. And if you look carefully, you will see the first computer model of a building produced in Australia, and this is now the Centrepoint Tower. 1969, we produced a 3D generated model of that. And this, by the way, is a specification writing system for, I can't tell you which company, which we did as consulting. 1968, we took in the first PhD student in what was then called architectural computing. He started working on building codes and how you could maximize the return if you're a developer. Actually, he gave up his PhD and started up a company and became quite rich. I often felt he should have given me some of that, but he didn't. I asked him, actually. Roughly 10 years later, we started a master's program, which was a coursework program. And then, a little more than 10 years later, we started the Bachelor of Design Computing, which Mary was going to tell you about. But the focus actually wasn't the teaching, although that took up all the time. The focus was the research, that this was an opportunity of a kind that never existed before. The notion that you could take ideas out of your head and externalize them and have somebody or have something do something with those ideas and give them back to you hadn't existed before. And somehow or other we were able to capture that, and we were able to take really intellectual ideas and operationalize them. And that was a big jump for everybody. And the sort of things we did were simulating building behavior, because there's good formal models for those, but we also did behaviors of a kind where there weren't formal models. We did some work for the New South Wales Health Education Department on what happens if there's an emergency in a high school. Are the exit paths satisfactory? We could build models of that, which previously, people would just use the code and say, you need 3 feet for this. We could actually test that. We did a lot of work on planning codes. The city planning code, Sydney, North Sydney, we did Melbourne. And then we did something which we didn't realize was novel at the time, is we did a lot of machine learning, which in those days was statistics, on modeling past designs so that an architect could go and start, for example, an office building and already get some indication of the spatial distributions in that building by simply looking at all the past buildings and the trends that had occurred. There was a huge building boom in Sydney for 20 years after, anyway, the credit squeeze in the 60s, things boomed. But it was really in the design theory part that I think we saw something that hadn't existed before, which was the notion that design was not necessarily this uniquely mysterious activity which fundamentally could not be understood. I used to have discussions right on those stairs with people teaching architectural design, and the discussions always went like this. You can never understand anything about design, comma. If you do, you will destroy it. I don't think either of those statements were correct or are correct. But this whole notion that you could have theory that wasn't just words was the driving idea. And we did a lot of stuff in that area. I mean, to give you some idea, in that period, we published something like 1,000 research papers, 60 books. That's a lot, right? We garnered 50% of all ARC funding in this area for about 20 years each year. That's a lot of performance that the university loves to see. I don't, I'm only interested in what you can do. We published a lot. We organized conferences and workshops like mad because there was so much to say, so many interesting things going on. These conferences still run, some of these. Now, they're in their third decade. And then we did a lot of consulting. Consulting, it's just like doing research, except you get paid a lot more, right? And then you go home at the end of the day. And we had quite serious clients, all the way up to Xerox PARC. And I did consulting. Xerox PARC invented lots of the stuff about personal computers, but they didn't know enough about design. We did work for IBM. The key center was on retainer. For Telsa. What's the, not Telsa, yeah. Who are they called today? The phone company. Telstra. Yeah, they weren't called. They were. So we were a force. We did consulting on what is now the Centerpoint Tower. We were the computer consultants for the MLC building. We were in 11 of the 200-odd entries for the Australian Parliament House building. Not the winning one, I'm sorry to say, but which is what I put there. By the way, that's not one of ours. We started two companies. They weren't called startups then. One which took the planning code, which IBM funded that work. Today, I don't think IBM funds this sort of stuff, but that's the way the world works. And it was mainly about economic feasibility studies and the sort of modeling of planning, which was lots of fun. And we worked. You'd be surprised how many famous architects who you think of as not doing this are very, very economically focused when they have clients. We looked at revamping all of King's Cross, which fortunately didn't happen because that would have demolished all the old buildings. The Building Workers Union stopped that. That was a Harry Seidler project, if you're interested. You could imagine what might have happened. And then some 20 years later, we started up another company which took a lot of the ideas. This was work funded by the government again, Department of Science, to build a drafting system, a modeling system. And we were truly lucky somebody bought the company before it did anything. What an amazing life, right? You didn't have to do anything, and they bought the intellectual property. So, and we were really at the cutting edge of what was computing on campus and even in Australia. This is, if you can't recognize it as me, a couple of years ago. This machine, or it's actually the second one, Sun was an amazing company that produced a machine of a kind that was one order more than anything that ever existed at the time. we got the first one in Australia. We used to run tours right here. We used to have to schedule them. There was so much interest in them. We took the first Sun computer to China in 1985. Required US Defense Department approval. We bought the first Apple Macintosh on campus. We had tours of Apple Macintosh, the one Apple Macintosh, in 1984. It was intellectual and it was fun, which is the best combination possible. So what happened out of all of this? Apart from we just had a great life and we produced lots of interesting environments for people. That's sort of what education is, not stuffing them full of facts, is we produced this ontology for describing design and designing. This is a way of talking about this arcane, mysterious activity that occurs in people's heads that is used by all sorts of people in all sorts of places. Really just quite amazingly. Many, many, many thousands of citations. And this notion that design falls within the cognitive acts of humans that can be described. And below that was this notion that there are fundamental principles which you can use to build any model of designing. It doesn't matter what kind it is. And then, more recently, designers we always thought of as, individuals working inside their heads with the medium that they operate with. And that's become a model that no longer matches reality because designers work together and because of the way we interact with each other through social media, our world has exploded. It's no longer designer with their head down, but we get constant feedback, including after you complete your design. And now you can do things. And let me see if I can show you this. This is a video where the colored dots are designers and the red dots are artifacts and the lines are social interactions through Facebook and other kinds of social media. And what this shows, what's behind it, is how the value systems of designers, well, it actually does show you it, but this isn't what you're meant to see. That's really odd. I tested this earlier because I've had this problem before. Let me describe with hands what you should see. Yeah, see, that's the beauty of life. It's a circle. Maybe you've heard that phrase? Yep. Anyway, what you would have seen is how these designers interact with artifacts and with, through social media, consumer response to their designs. And if you look behind it, you will see how their value systems change and why it's not, which is a demonstration of why it's not possible for a designer to actually design the same thing again. Because having designed it, they change cognitively, and as soon as it's exposed to the world, that changes them again. So given the same brief, you can't design the same thing again. And this just demonstrates that. So, there's a lot of stuff going on, I guess, is what I'm trying to suggest with all this. A lot of work on design methods, design cognition, understanding what happens in the mind. In the past, it was thought that since designers produce unique designs, each design is different, you can't study it. But it turns out what's in your mind is not different. And it comes as a real shock to people who are designers in their own disciplines that they actually look surprisingly similar to other people designing as well. And I like showing how architects and engineers who are designing are surprisingly similar. Neither likes to hear that, by the way. So what's next? Now, people tend to focus on technology. And so they should, but technology is ephemeral. Right? My little watch, which is not a digital watch, has more computing power than the 128K Mac. Right? And all it's doing is keeping time. What's in these computers used to be supercomputers. Right? The capacity computation, which most people don't even understand deeply what computation is, and you have to come to a different talk to understand that, has given us something that really didn't exist before and is mind-expanding. So maybe the next thing is to do with measuring designing, measuring it. What are humans doing, and what can that do for us? So here, for example, is some work with a former student from Newcastle on what is it, where are designers looking when they're doing parametric design? So this shows you where they're looking, and the size of the circle represents the amount of time they're spending. And this then feeds into designing new kinds of interfaces for designers. And also, we look at what's behind it cognitively in terms of vision theory. And it turns out architects form a very narrow slice of what humans do when they're just looking at scenes. Here's some work so that's studying physiology. This is studying neurophysiology. What's happening in your brain when you're doing things? The top left is a little segment. This is electroencephalography, looking at brain waves. What's happening in your head when you're doing tightly constrained design tasks might be called problem solving. Right? This is with a group I have in Portugal. And on the top left is that. Let's see if we get good stuff out. Yes. Right? So we can see, if we, more slowly, it's really indicative rather than specific, that both sides of the brain are sort of involved, and when they're finished, they sort of relax, right, with the whole brain changes. This is doing a more designerly task, and if you look at the top right-hand corner, what you see is that slowly it shifts to the left side of the brain. So there's different parts of the brain are activated when you're doing fundamentally different kinds of tasks. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what this means. Here's some work I'm doing with some people at Virginia Tech, and looking at what happens in the brain when you get people to design using different design methods. So the left-hand one, let's not worry too much exactly what it's saying, but what you get out of it is that when you're doing brainstorming, it's mainly the right hemisphere of the prefrontal cortex, sort of this part of the brain, that is primarily active. The brain everywhere is active, all the time, but this has increased activation. Morphological analysis, which is a different kind of tool, it turns out it's the left prefrontal cortex, more dorsolateral. And TRIZ, and if you don't know what TRIZ is, that's all right. It's just a different kind of design method used in the aircraft and automotive industries, takes the whole brain. Well, that's amazing that we can find this out, and this is just the networks that are slowly developed. This leads us somewhere to a place that we never thought existed. I'm going to show you the last slide, or the last movie, which I hope works. And this is now brain-computer interaction. This is a $799 device. US dollars, I admit, so $1,000 Australian today, maybe $1,200 tomorrow. And what you're going to see is this. This picks up brain waves, and the person is going to think zoom. Okay? And then if they've got enough, so it does some machine learning, just learns the characteristic of the brainwave. When they've got enough, they connect it to the zoom in a CAD model. Let's see what happens. Right, so they're picking up the brain waves. They've got enough now. Yes, they'll say yes. And now the person thinks zoom. Think zoom, think zoom, think zoom. And what happens? It zooms. There's clearly more worlds in front of us. And design is at the forefront. That's really important. Design is at the forefront of it. It's not at the tail end anymore. Not some arcane activity produced by hippies that you don't understand. It's right center in what the world might look like, and we're there if we want to be. And that's where I'm going to stop. But the key center of design computing is a whole raft of people across the last 50-odd years. All of them in their own way contributed to everything that you've seen, maybe very indirectly, and some of it very directly. And it's always people, the intellectual activity of people, the openness and the environment. And we were very lucky that in the beginning, nobody in the faculty knew what we were doing, because they probably would have stopped it. And that's also important. If you want to make change, you have to know how to do it. Let me stop there.
I wanted to talk retrospectively, but more specifically, oh my gosh, look at you guys. I didn't see all of you before because I was facing that way. This is awesome. I am so honored that you are all here to listen to this. It's just so nice to see so many familiar faces. I called my talk the Influential Design Lab. And the reason I did that is because I think it's a very special place. And I think maybe you have to leave to appreciate how special it was or is. Why is it so special? And I think one of the things that's unique is in the design lab, it's about design, designing, and design research. And what you're designing, while it's important and it provides context, whether it's architecture or you're designing a new kind of computer interface, or as you'll see in a few minutes, you're designing a marionette, it's about design. I don't think there's another place that takes that kind of a stance or that kind of a perspective. So I wanted to talk about the Influential Design Lab. You'll notice my reflections go from 1990 to 2018. I didn't stop with the year that I left because the Design Lab is influential still on my work. And it gave me a stance and a perspective that was unique, I thought, in the world. I came from an engineering faculty, and I joined an architecture faculty, and nobody was upset about the fact that I didn't know how to design architecture or buildings. I could do structure, but not the architecture. I also wanted to think about the word reflection in a couple ways. Reflection, in one sense, and the way I want to describe it here, is that the work that was done at the Design Lab reflected what was happening outside. It reflects the world. And so I'll show a timeline in a few minutes because I think what's happening in the world has an impact on how we design and how we do our design research. And you can't separate the two. You can't say design is independent of everything else. So in a way, what we've done over the years has reflected the world. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to finish up with not just looking back, but now what? Where do we go next? What's important next? Also, reflection is an activity. It's a very human level activity where we reflect ourselves on what we've done over time and how that's changed us, our identity, the ideas in the field. And so I gave you the whole talk in like one slide to start with, and then I'll go into some of the details. And who was it today? Jose Dembski said something about a circle. I should have drawn a circle. Because you'll see, in 1990, the really big deal was artificial intelligence. And in 2018, the really big deal is artificial intelligence. And that's fascinating because it did go out of popularity for quite a while there. When we started in 1990, or when I came here in 1990, that's when the big deal was representing design knowledge. How could you do that? How could design knowledge be something that could be generalized across the context of design? And you'll see FBS, case-based reasoning, coevolution. But then something happened in the world. Computing wasn't just something that you were trained to use at work in order to improve your productivity. Computing became everywhere. It was in your pocket. It's now on your wrist. You could wear headsets. You could interact with public displays that had computers in them. They weren't just displays. And so we left the screen behind. Some of us still use a screen, and I saw the labs here still have a lot of screens in them. But we're moving away from that. And that brought us into the world of tangible, gesture, tabletop, virtual worlds. And I'll talk about that in a little while. But all that foundational work was still relevant because we brought that with us. So how do we understand the effect of tangible? We look at the FBS models. How do we understand the impact of gesture when you're interacting with computers using gesture? We brought coevolution in. So we used all that foundational work, went into these new technologies to better understand design and the impact design had on us as humans. And then we move into this data-driven machine learning. All that stuff that was really hard in the beginning, you just train up a deep learning neural net and you got it. Who needs knowledge representation anymore? And that's led us to a better understanding of what we mean by novelty, surprise, curiosity. Now the computational power of these machine learning algorithms allow us to bring that into the experience. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So we made these transitions from knowledge representation, that early days of AI and knowledge representation, we transitioned to studying the affordances of external representations. That was that transition from AI into going beyond the screen. And in that sense, we're looking at creative thinking, creative doing, and creative making. So we started by how do we think, and then what do we do, and then how do we make. And so I'll just put some diagrams up there. I wanted to show you some of the artifacts of the design research. I think many people may have thought I was going to talk about the Bachelor of Design Computing, and I'm in fact not going to. That was one of the things I did here. It was very important, very influential. But what made that possible was the community of people who did this kind of work and then thought that it was possible to develop a program around this. This is not architecture. This is not engineering. This is about design. And so there's your FBS model. There's the coevolution model. And more recently, the creative cognition model, concepts like surprise. How does surprise happen? How does creativity happen? And we presented it as sort of a metacognitive process. But as a metacognitive process, now we have the opportunity to bring that AI back in. But let's take a break. So all that foundational work, now there's all this new technology out here. What happens if we design with graspable objects? This is a project here very early, before there was even something called tangible computing, on how designers could design on a tabletop system, moving objects around with their hands. And our studies were, how does that affect cognition? Does that encourage creativity? Does it lead to more creative designs? And we wrote a number of papers on that. Then we thought, well, maybe you could generalize that even more. So I wanted to show you just some of the impact of some of the studies that we were doing by showing you a couple of videos. Let's see how this goes. This is coming back to the affordances of taking what we know and putting it on the external world and what happens then. So we looked at this idea of designing within the design, and how is it that we could think about that process of, yeah, it's a little slow, being inside a design. And this was the virtual worlds work that carried on for about 10 years here, where we looked at how you could sketch on one side and you could build 3D models and walk around them, sort of like we have now, only you're actually represented as an avatar in there. We did some work on designing virtual world museums and how now buildings could become much more interactive because there is no physical components to them, they're all virtual. This project looks at how you can take advantages of the affordances of not design knowledge that's not in your head. And NatureNet is a project where we're looking at crowdsourcing design. And that is, how can you build an environment, a computing environment, where you are leveraging what thousands of people know instead of just what you and your design team knows. So we thought that designing would not only be helpful for the artifact you're designing, crowdsourcing design, but that it would motivate people to develop an emotional attachment to the thing they were designing. These are a few projects where we got into, very early on here in the design lab, this concept of curiosity. There's this idea that curiosity is sort of the essence of learning, and it's the essence of creativity. So curiosity, by definition, is the desire to know or desire to learn. Remember the sentient? Those of you who are here, it's gone now. It's been replaced with something much better looking. But it was pretty basic. And that was how we can design environments that would be curious about us. How could it sense things about human activity and use that to produce a display that we would be curious about? And so we looked at that loop of curious buildings, curious people. The curious non-player characters in a virtual world. How could learning occur when there were no goals? How could curiosity generate the goals? And then Q-Chef is a more recent one, which I'll talk about in a minute, but can we build models of curiosity that will encourage people to move outside their own thinking, sort of thinking outside the box, move outside their own habits? Willful marionette was, how can we provoke people to interact with things where there's no instructions and there's no goals? So it's all about, how do we think about designing the world around us to encourage our creativity, our curiosity, and our learning? What can we understand about curiosity? So the sentient, this is just a blow-up slide of that. We were thinking that if you could collect data about the people in the room, then you could understand what made them, what they do, what the patterns of usage were, and the room could respond. This was a really difficult thing to do. We had very basic sensors and very basic abilities. But we did use the World Wide Web as a source of producing content that would encourage curiosity. So it was a very early model. This was non-player characters. This was our project with our sheep. The sheep are the smart ones in this virtual world. And they had a learning algorithm in them where if they didn't understand something about the world, they would interact with it and interact with it until they figured it out. And it developed into a book that said that you don't actually need to give your learning agents goals. They can define their own goals in order to understand the world around them. And then the willful marionette. I want to show a video of this one. This was a fascinating project that was, in a way, also about curiosity. Computer's a little bit slow. So this was a project with some artists, and one of the things that I think is fascinating about design research is that you can be designing something specific like a building, or you could be designing something like a virtual world, or you can be designing a marionette. And some of the same principles apply, and what generalizes across those is what's important. What we wanted to understand in this design, first of all, the artists had a very different set of goals than we did. They were designing to provoke a human response to the frailty of the human body. So they developed a 3D model of the partner. There's a male-female partner, the male body, and they printed it out. So this is his body in parts, and they strung it up, and they attached it to strings and motors. Now, what did we do? We had to design the gestures. What are the gestures that the marionette would produce? And what were the gestures that humans would do that would cause a reaction? This was displayed in the Smithsonian and in various other places in New York. And what was interesting was the stance that people took towards this. And this is some work that was done, again, with Design Lab people, even though it was done in North Carolina. And that was, how do people respond to this? And just as an anecdote, what happened is that people who are sort of tech savvy, who could see the wires up there and they could see the machine on top of it, started to interact with it to understand what its boundaries were. What does it recognize? How far away can I be? What will it do when I do this? Does it mimic me, or what is it doing? And people who were not so tech savvy could just ignore the fact that there was a machine up there and immediately anthropomorphized, thought of it as thinking, as being mad at them. It's not, when's it going to look at me? Why doesn't he like me? Because it would recognize more than one person. So what was interesting is this single object, and we all experience similar objects and technologies every day, but our stance depends on our context and our experiences. And as designers, we have to take that into consideration. Let's see if I can get back to the talk. And then this is our makerspace. This is our version of what you have downstairs, which used to be called the workshop, and it's now the Fab Lab or Fab something. And what we're doing in this room, and I'll run this video if we have time at the end, but we wanted to encourage people to come in and learn how to do this, but not to take a course for credit and not to necessarily use it for a course. We actually have a grant from NSF to study the effect of playful learning, informal learning, on their performance in the classroom, which is an interesting idea, that instead of studying learning in the classroom, you're studying the effect of learning outside the classroom on learning in the classroom. So our makerspace looks very different, and we have a number of projects in there. We run a fashion show every year on interactive textiles, and we design and build physical computing artifacts with Arduinos and sensors in them. Now, transitioning back again, I'm going to try and close the circle. What we transition from the affordances of physical computing back into data-driven design. What does that mean? So now, building on again, this idea of knowledge representation and physical artifacts, we are looking more and more towards co-creativity. So computer support tools, creativity support tools, how does tangible computing affect creative cognition? Generative systems, can we automatically generate creative artifacts? Now we're thinking, can computers actually be colleagues in an improvisational sense? So one of the projects we're working on is how do you take a sketch, if a person is sketching, can you respond in a way that does a conceptual shift for them? So for example, if you're designing a bridge, can it find things that look like bridges but conceptually different? If you're designing a toothbrush, can it find things that look like toothbrushes but are conceptually different? And how would it do that is we start by training up a neural network with hundreds of thousands of labeled sketches. And now when you sketch, it can recognize the sketch, but it can shift to another cluster and say, well, that sketch also looks like a bathtub. It's not just a bridge. And so we're coming back. We don't even care anymore about knowledge representation in the traditional sense. We just train the networks. And then we use that representation to respond to humans who are doing something like sketching. Beyond sketching, we're also looking at recipes. How can you present recipes to people to get them to eat a more diverse diet? We're looking at peak, which is how can you develop a sequence of things for a person to learn that will lead them from something they know to something they want to know, but in a pathway that encourages curiosity. We tested out our models of curiosity with a study of people interacting with a recommendation system called Curious George. We used the Amazon book database, and we would use a standard recommendation engine to produce the top 50 books that are close to your preference, reorder them using a computational model of surprise, and show you the surprising ones first, and then we ask them whether that's something that's both interesting and surprising. And that's in the sense of getting people to move outside their box, how to get people to read beyond their preference and into things that they don't know yet. And again, it was a neural network. We model surprise as the conditional probability of co-occurrence. And so we associate surprise with expectation. Now, how do you design? I'm going to just stay here for a minute, but how do you now design the environment in a way that it will engage us in learning, engage our curiosity? And I think that when we come back to the AI, with the deep learning models that we're able to build now, we can build these models of the world around us without doing the knowledge representation, but in a representation that allows us to look at things that might be surprising because they haven't occurred together before. So where do we go next? I think the deep learning and the AI has had a big impact on our understanding of how computation can assist or augment human ability. We can now go from data to design spaces. All that effort in building those case-based reasoning models, those coevolutionary models, we can now generate these representations from data. We have an opportunity now to consider how co-creativity can encourage human curiosity. How can computers be colleagues? We have an opportunity now to look at the built environment now in terms of buildings and architecture. Our early entry into this was to put up sensors like the sentient and to automate. Smart homes are automated homes. They're not homes that we interact with. How can now the home or the building be a colleague instead of automated? And then I want to leave with a final statement that one of the things that is happening in the world right now that we need to pay attention to as designers is this huge ethical issues that are being raised by the computing itself. We look at issues around Facebook, social computing, drones, machines that are out there that were designed for good things. Facebook designed for good. And we haven't figured out how to understand how we incorporate unintended consequences and how we think about the ethics in computing. And I attended a conference a couple weeks ago on computational creativity, and there was an interesting talk there. It said, if we can build computational models of creativity, if we can develop something called computational creativity, and that helps us understand creativity, and it helps us interact with people in creative ways, can we build computational ethics? Can we use computation to better understand ethics, both in terms of a kind of a sandbox to try things out? If we build social computing, if we develop drones, if we develop all this technology that's done for a good reason, can we understand the ethical implications of unintended consequences? And so as we move forward, as the design lab moves forward, as design researchers move forward, now is the time to reflect the outside world and the ethical issues that are facing us on a daily basis and think about how design and design computation can incorporate ethics. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mary Lou. And we do have a little bit of time for a few questions, and then we'll have a lot more time after 5 o'clock for more conversations or drinks. So I mentioned in my introduction that I started my academic position here in the school almost 10 years ago in 2009. But actually, I first came here in 2007 as a visiting PhD student. My plan was to stay for 6 months, and I'm still here. And I think the reason why I decided to apply for an academic position and why I'm still here is because when I was here as a visiting PhD student, there was something in the design lab, a certain spirit in the design lab that captured me and that I really wanted to come back to and wanted to be part of. And I think both of your talks, John and Mary Lou, very beautifully described some of that spirit that you have created over the many years and that I believe is still ongoing in the design lab, and people working in the design lab today are still continuing to build on that spirit and to further develop that spirit. So
thank you so much. My name's Leanne Loke. I work in Design Lab, and it was absolutely fascinating to hear both of you talk about the incredible history and journey of the Design Lab and all the intellectual thinking and innovations that you've done. But I guess what you ended on there, Mary Lou, with the ethical issue, ethical computing, was actually the question I had in my head when John ended his talk, and you were talking about the value systems, shifting value systems that designers have because of all the interaction we have in the digital, virtual, social media space. And so I'm sort of interested if you could talk a little bit more about how those two things come together, because now we have all these AI, software agents out there that are basically having a kind of, rampant creative intellect of their own, that we're also going to be in that kind of environment. So also how ethics, if we're educating designers, do you have any recommendations for how we're going to navigate this new space?
I think the people in the group here who are artists might find this a little bit easier than the people who aren't, because I think many artists provoke and cause people to think about things that are hard to think about through their art. But as designers, you're always designing with the best of intentions, and you're designing for good. Like we design buildings, to improve the quality of our lives, as everyone has said. And then we just assume that's what everybody thinks, that's what everybody wants to do. And I think the difficult question or the difficult thing to answer is, how do you develop an educational system or even a research agenda where ethics is part of it? One of the things I've been reading lately, it's a book called Giving Voice to Values. And in that book, there was a really good example of the difference between ethics and values. So ethics is a social construct. It's something that's out there. It's embedded in our policies and our laws. And so you can point to something and say that's ethical or unethical, because you can make a ruling as to whether it is according to this external construct. And I think what Giving Voice to Values said, that every individual has a value system, and if we could just tap into what's good about every person and make them feel empowered to speak up or to say or to comment when something that they see is not good, then we begin to get to a community and a world order where values matter. An ethical construct has to be there, but you can twist that and bend that to be whatever you want. What's that book called? Lies, Statistics, and Damned Lies. So you can make anything ethical. So I think in the first step, we need to teach in a way that feels like students can give voice to values. In the research sense, I think we can build computational models of ethical behavior, of ethical products, of ethical consequences, just like we did creativity. It's kind of like John said in the beginning. When he got started, everyone said, you can't formalize design, and if you do, you'll ruin it. And the same thing with creativity. You can't codify creativity. If you build a computer that you say is creative, then that's no longer creativity. I think that's where we are with ethics. We could use computers to study ethics, and that's a research question.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Chris Kennedy. I'm an architect since I graduated 2 years after John left this university. And no, I graduated, 2 years after you joined the university in 66, as I graduated 67. My question is to do both of you in point of fact, because you talked about unintended consequences, and you also said that I think we can design pretty much, or the computers can help us, or maybe they themselves can design. Now, you've got unintended consequences being a part of your theorem that I just saw on the board there. How do you determine, because artists like to do things that are oftentimes to try to challenge our thinking about certain subjects, whereas John is going along a different theory, saying that, and I don't know whether that's all your theory, obviously not, but the point is it's a piece of your action. And then, John, you're suggesting that we should be able to compute things, and somehow that becomes a design piece of something. I'm interested in how those two things get together and how we don't have accidents that are actually nasty.
You can have that one.
I think let's start off with the notion that what's in our heads, we always used to think could only be described verbally. I mean, that's what novelists used approaches to gain access to that. Proust was very good and very labored about trying to get a few minutes of his thoughts down in 200 or 300 pages, very slow-moving pages, by the way. I think two things have happened. One is the barrier between what's in our thoughts and what we can externalize in a more formal way has shifted. And it's come as a big surprise, I think, to many people as to what can be computed. And I think there's a lot more surprises to come. So that's the first thing. But it doesn't capture human experience, which is truly rich and varied and is not fixed. Human experience is not fixed. There's no past that you recall. What there is a past that you inform the present with. But that, I think, can be computed too, right? But we're nowhere near that at all. I don't think computers can design, because I think design involves a set of value systems and changing those value systems as you design, which we don't yet have the capacity to do. But I would not now say that we would never have that capacity, because so much of what we said we could never compute is now computable in a very different way, in a very, very different way than we thought. Previously, as Mary Lou said, we thought we had to have these structures to which you would hang your knowledge onto, but it turns out there's another way of doing it, which today is called deep learning, which generates the structures for you. I mean, these might be a little abstruse for us today, but the distinction is you don't actually need to know a lot in order to get a lot. But it's not the same as humans. Humans, I don't think, will go out of style for a really long time, if ever, because humans do something which we don't see computers doing well, except humans, are so curious about making things happen that they might build computers to do this, and that is they adapt. Humans are constantly adapting. And it's such an interesting thing. We always used to think the brain finished development, around about the age of 25. It turns out the brain continues to generate synapses, which is the connection between neurons, every day, and generates new neurons every day, which when you get to be over 21 like me, that's really important. But it loses them if there's no need for them. And the question is, as humans, we're constantly changing. If we find that we need to have things that we didn't do before as humans, we have that capacity, this natural evolutionary capacity to constantly change ourselves based on need. I believe that's computable too, by the way.
I wanted to try my version of an answer to your question. So we've got to the point now where we can interact with a computer and say something the equivalent of surprise me, right? Computational models of many examples of sketches or books or recipes. And if the computer knows what I've been reading or eating or doing because I interact with the computer, it can surprise me because it can use those models to give me something I didn't expect. It'd be hard to imagine that 10 years ago. How would it do that? What's that even mean for the computer to give us something surprising? And by surprising, I don't mean just something we've never seen before, but it's also really interesting to us. So it's surprising and valuable. Now let's take another step. Is it possible to design systems and artifacts and products that are ethical? Well, I don't know. I think that's another question, but I wouldn't start with no. I mean, we now have computers that can surprise us. Can we build ethical computers? And as we start down that path, we'll learn a lot about ethics and values. Whereas we started down that path of computational creativity, could we understand design? Could we build models of it? Can we understand creativity? Can we build models of it? Well, it turns out we can. So can we understand ethics and build models of it in a way that we can say, I'm going to design this kind of a thing? What are the ethical issues? And so when we talk about designing interactive buildings or buildings that engage our curiosity, let's just start there. then the building would have to have a model of my appetite for curiosity or my interest in interacting with buildings. And that's possible now in a kind of a scary way. And that's where the ethics comes back. How much is too much information to collect about us? When do we cross the line from that makes a better interaction experience for us, and that's creepy?
Oh, so good to see you both, John and Mary. Thank you so much for your talks. And Andy, it was really great to see you. I just had a question about the slide that you showed, John, using the brain-computer interface. We've been, Leanne and I have worked on, and people in the group, a number of different projects. We have some really talented PhD students at the moment doing project using EEG sensors, and we've been really interested in looking at how, for example, collaborating with psychiatrists and psychologists and neuroscientists to work out ways to visualize the mind, we've been primarily looking at using the meditating mind, which is a form of mind training, so it's interesting to study. And I'm just wondering, I was really curious with the video that you showed where you see the future of brain-computer interface in terms of computing.
Actually, that video I don't think is the future at all. I think that's way too primitive a notion to connect, motor activities in the brain with some traditional CAD modeling. I think, firstly, mental activities in the brain are not well understood in relation to mental activities in the mind. We're at very, very early days. Recent history tells us, though, that we're likely to be able to make connections that we don't yet have. Right? We seem to be able to externalize and represent much more about ourselves than we ever thought possible. But what we haven't got to, or even close to, sort of anything deep about what happens in human thinking when we're measuring brain activity. We're really a long way. It's sort of like, if you look inside a computer and you measure the activity, what you'll see is electrons running around. And you see a lot of them running around. And when you do word processing, you see electrons running around. When you do CAD modeling, you also see electrons running around. That's too low a level, yet that's where we are at the moment. We're finding out, someone had a very nice phrase. If you remember, there's a 19th century idea that says you could tell the character of a person by the shape of their skull and their physiognomy. So, for example, if your eyes are close together, that's an indicative of being criminal, right? If you've got a high forehead, intellectual. Actually, it may be true, I don't know. But you know what I mean? We're at that level with the brain, right? This part of the brain is active when you're generating speech. That's absolutely so. And although everyone's brain is surprisingly different, almost everybody's brain is producing that activity in roughly the same place. Some people actually have flipped hemispheres. I don't know that that's enough to know all that to give us a good way of externalizing thought. What we saw there is externalizing motor activity. We could map thoughts about motor activity onto commands, and it works beautifully, and it's actually much better developed. What we don't have is sitting here with an abstract idea that I can generate externally. I can't, at the moment, imagine how that's possible, but I've learned not to say never.
I would answer with watch the science fiction movies.
Yes.
That's where it is. We don't know how to get there, but science fiction. When I worked at the National Science Foundation, we had an NSF Day, which was called National Science Fiction Day, because science fiction is the precursor to science. So we see it in the movies, now we do the science.